Thank you all for coming. I think we will begin. We're a few minutes late, so we'll adjust accordingly, not taking any time away from the speaker, of course, but we have a bit of flexibility towards the end of the program, so I think that's okay. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce Tom. Yes, Tom, here we go. Tom came to Cardiff in 2007, which was, for all of us at Cardiff, a wonderful occasion, but for me in particular, because I went to Cardiff in 2004 to join a fantastic team of Professor Fawcett, Gordon Tucker, Paul Tench, who then all left. And I felt a bit lonely. And then came Tom, who was a real blessing. And then shortly after, Gerard O'Grady. It was at the same time. Well, Tom's presence was felt maybe a bit bigger than this big personality. And since that time, we've gone on to achieve what I think are pretty great things together, and we make a pretty good team. And Tom's been a really valued colleague. He's got the special qualities of being an excellent researcher at the grammatical level, at the discourse level, at the context level. He crosses the whole spectrum. He's an excellent colleague. He's an excellent teacher, well appreciated by all of our students, and a real pleasure to work with. And I realize now that we have worked together for 8 years, Tom, that I feel like I know him quite well as a person, but not so well in terms of his professional development, and I think that's what I meant to do as I introduced someone. So I decided to Google Tom to find out what I could find. And as if any of you have done the same, you will know that you will come across a rather famous Elvis impersonator named Tom Bartlett. And I must say that at first glance at the photograph of this person as Elvis, I thought, oh, Tom has been leading a secret double life that we didn't know about, that I thought I would reveal to us all today. But on closer inspection, no indeed. There is only the one true Dr. Tom Bartlett, the esteemed linguist. So I will just very briefly say a few things. Tom did his PhD using fieldwork that he collected in Guyana, which looked at discourse among the local community, the Amerindian peoples living there, and also the international bodies. He has played an important role in editing 2 very important volumes, along with his esteemed colleague Swantaine and O'Grady, relating the concept of choice in SFL. And indeed, one section which Tom was really instrumental in making sure happened was an entire section devoted to, oh no, I've forgotten, social and contextual constraints on choice, where there is a themed section in that volume dedicated entirely to some of the kinds of issues that Tom will probably be touching on today. And if that weren't enough, he's also currently editing with Gerard O'Grady the Routledge Handbook of Systemic Functional Linguistics, and contributing to other handbooks which are forthcoming. Also, he is the author of a book he published in 2012, which has got a rather long title, so I've had to write it down. I'm going to read it out. Hybrid Voices and Collaborative Change, Situating Positive Discourse Analysis. And there might have been a little bit more to the title, or does it end there? I think it's the full title. Lots of really interesting things. It's been a very received book, and a lot, I think, of what Tom's going to talk about will come out in the talk will be related to the book. But fundamentally, Tom's main interest is between context of discourse and the language used by different social and cultural groups, but especially participatory democracy. Right? And today, I'm very pleased to introduce Tom as he talks to us today about the concepts of voice, heteroglossia, polyphony in literature, sociology, and linguistics, and SFL perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last year I was on holiday with my family, and I went across a zip liner for about half a mile with my son Jamie, and I thought, if I hold on tight and just look straight ahead, we'll all be over in 30 seconds. Well, this is my first plenary. If I hold on tight and look straight ahead, it'll all be over in 50 minutes. So here we go. Yeah, thanks very much for that, ladies. The title is Concepts of Voice, Heteroglossia and Polyphony in Literature, Sociology and Linguistics, an SFL perspective, lots of big, clever words to make it like a plenary. And in the next 40 minutes I'll try and make it a lot simpler. Okay, I was going to start with an overall definition of voice in linguistics, but the whole point of my talk is there isn't one. So instead I did the old ploy of going to the dictionary. And so we have voice, but there's an interesting mixture of, in this definition here from the Collins Dictionary. Voice, one indeed, the faculty of utterance or speech, just what we study as linguists. What comes out, the noises we make with our mouths, with our faces in other words. But also an instrument or medium of expression, so it's the channel through which our expressivity, our individuality can come out. Not just that, but as well as the channel, it is used to mean the expressed wish or opinion, and the right of expression. So there's quite an interesting range just within the dictionary definition there, and all of these come up in the social linguistics literature, which is what I'm going to look at. So for today's talk, I'll start off with Bakhtin, who was really the first person to introduce these concepts. They've been developed in the Soviet Union and sort of under the radar of the Western world, as it were, and they're discovered later on in the 60s and developed, and retrospectively Bakhtin's ideas were brought into Western social linguistics. Bakhtin got voice in literary or social theory. Very, very interesting writer, because he's really a social linguist, but a lot of his data comes from literature, and it's hard to say whether he's had a literary studies or social studies. An awful lot of social theory, but he uses Dostoevsky in particular as his database. And fascinating reading. And then crossing the Iron Curtain, we've got Himes, Bernstein and Blommaert, who's voice in social linguistics theory. You'll notice that B is a very good letter for this. We've got Bakhtin, Bernstein, Blommaert. We've also got Wendy Boucher and Margaret Berry in the book we edited. And then you've got the case study from Bartlett. So if you've got a B in your surname, this is maybe your area. So we'll look at the case study from international development, which I was in Guyana with my wife at the back there, who works for the Department for International Development, and I was over there with nothing to do, so I ended up doing my PhD fieldwork there. So talk to that now, voice, what it means. Okay. So starting off with Bakhtin, a very well-known quote about, he talks about the word, but I think we can take the word to mean the utterance or parole, language in general, and the way it's out there, it's not from a dictionary, it's already how it's used, it comes with its own history, and we become part of that history when we speak. So what he says is the word in language is someone else's, it becomes one's own only when the speaker populates it with their own intentions, their own accent, when they appropriate the word, adapting it to their own semantic and expressive intention. Prior to this moment of appropriation, the word does not exist in a neutral and impersonal language. It is not after all out of a dictionary that the speaker gets their words, but rather it exists in other people's mouths, in other people's contexts, serving other people's intentions. It is from there, I'm sure he spelled that correctly, it's from there that one must take the word and make it one's own. Okay, so language has a social history. It's not written down, it's in dictionaries, but that's not really where it comes from. Words have social histories, language is what we use it to mean, and we join that current. We can either go along and swim with the current, or we accentuate the word, take it and use it of ourselves. We can't just use a word anywhere we want. We can't use dog to mean cat, but every time we use words, we add our own accent. We can do that to a greater or lesser degree. Okay, following from that idea of the word is this, with the social history, we've got Bakhtin's concept of heteroglossia, which means heteroglossia, more than one language, a couple of things simultaneously. As a consequence of the fact that words come with their social history, with their baggage, and are used anew every time, at any given time, in any given place, there will be a set of conditions, social, historical, meteorological, physiological, maybe even hair colour, that will ensure that a word uttered in that place and at that time will have a meaning different than it would have under any other conditions. All utterances are heteroglot in that they are functions of a matrix of forces practically impossible to recoup and therefore impossible to resolve. I think there's two sides to that. The idea of this utterance being heteroglot. In the first place, any utterance can have a multitude of different meanings. It can speak in lots of different ways. It doesn't come with a fixed meaning. It depends on the context it's used in. Similarly, when it is used in context, it brings with it lots of meanings from lots of different histories, the historical, meteorological, physiological conditions. So it brings with it a lot of history, which are very specific to the context of use, impossible to resolve. The meaning is very specific there, but hard for the social linguists is to try and resolve that, of course. And there's a converse side of this, following on from the idea of the word as having a social history. while you've got that history, the other people's voices that are out there in society, and your own individual appropriation of it, when you have groups of people working together in speech communities consistently, regularly, they develop their own speech style with this relatively shared concept of the word. Words and utterances have their own shared meaning within that special group. So that means that instead of just having one language, this was radical at the time, it's possibly old hat to everyone here now, there isn't just Russian or Arabic or English. There are existences of many varieties within a single but non-unitary language, what Bakhtin calls speech genres. Okay? So that includes things like register, which we study a lot of in SFL, but not just register. I'll make the point that there are other varieties apart from register that maybe we need to focus on a bit more. Okay, so Bakhtin was saying that when you have an establishment, a state of any sort, any ideological institution, you've got the centripetal and the centrifugal forces, this diffusion of language across time and space that it's used differently by different people all the time, and people develop their own speech genres, or communities develop their own speech genres, is the centrifugal forces, as the language moves away from a single meaning, and the state tries to impose centripetal forces. It tries to get us all to speak the same language again, the establishment, under various guises, whether it be the state, the education system, the church, whatever. What are the causes and effects of this? Well, because it creates unity and common understanding. That's what the brochures will tell us. And we all need to speak the same language so we can all get on together. And or, on purpose or by mistake, if you regulate the way people speak, and from a Hallidayan perspective, speech is action, you're regulating people's action. Secondly, another thing that's very common in Hallidayan linguistics, etc., if you have as the centripetal, the main variety of the language, then those people who use that as their everyday language will have an advantage in society because they will just be operating in their own field, their field of socialization. It won't be difficult for them. People who have been socialized into different ways of speaking but are forced to use this dominant language will be institutionally unequal. So you've got this centripetal and centrifugal forces going on at the same time, which is going to be an important thing, what I'm talking about. So what's Bakhtin's answer to this? In the same way that he says there are many different speech genres and that there's lots of different ways of speaking, he relates this fact of language to argumentation and dialogue. And he talks about in rhetoric, there's the unconditionally innocent and the unconditionally guilty. There's a right, there's a wrong. We try and prove our case. There is complete victory and destruction of the opponent. That's what we try and do in rhetoric, one form of literature. In dialogue, the destruction of the opponent also destroys that very dialogic sphere where the word lives. So if the word is created through the currents of history it arrives on and our appropriation of that voice, our changing of that voice, closing it down means we get rid of that very creativity that allows for language and society to progress, and we wouldn't want to close down dialogue in any public spheres. Only a polyphonist, someone who speaks with many voices like Dostoevsky, consents in the struggles of opinions and ideologies, an incomplete dialogue on ultimate questions. So what Bakhtin is saying here is that there are no answers. We were talking yesterday about immanence, the language system being immanent. Bakhtin is saying, well, everything's immanent. There is no final answer to anything. There's no final linguistic theory any more than there's a final language. What we have is lots of different voices, all contributing in different ways and carrying us along on the stream. This is what polyphony does. We give equal weight, or we give weight to all these voices and try and make sense of them all together rather than trying to close them down through rhetoric. Okay, so then we have what's either called ventriloquism or ventriloquation. Because Bakhtin was talking about literature in particular, he was claiming that Dostoevsky, rather than closing down ways of speaking like most writers at the time, tried to give voice to all the different sectors of Russian society without necessarily privileging all the people. So ventriloquism refers to the many voices that can be heard and recognized in a novel, serving to express authorial attention, but in a refracted way, and as it would appear at a certain distance from his lips. So it's interesting here that even though we're talking about polyphony and having all these voices, so what we'd have, Bakhtin would say that instead of having rhetoric and closure, carnival. All these different voices at once, making sense as a carnival rather than closure. Through the carnival and carnivalesque literature, a world upside down is created, ideas and truths are endlessly tested and contested, and all demand equal dialogic status. The jolly relativity of all things is proclaimed by alternative voices within the carnivalized literary text that deprivilege the authoritative voice of the hegemony through the mingling of high culture with the profane. For Bakhtin, it is within literary forms like the novel that one finds the site of resistance to authority, the place where cultural and potentially political change can take place. So in other words, he's saying for contestation, for opposing hegemonic forces, some of the important talks about that yesterday, it's not trying to close down or cut off the ideas. For Bakhtin, the idea would be to have a polyphony of voices, a rabble. They're giving everyone voices, and it's the carnival that wins out over closure, which the state maybe tries to impose. Okay, so that's literature. Back in the real world, as if literature wasn't real, what I want to look at is the ideas, in what way have Bakhtin's ideas of voice and heteroglossia in literature been taken up in the study of language and social life? And how viable is the concept of polyphony if transferred to social situations which bring different groups together? Okay, so one of the first figures to take up the person most associated with the notion of voice in Western European or Western social linguistics is Delheim, who's American, not European. Voice is very much associated with him, and it's to do with centrifugal rights, to borrow Bakhtin's term. They've got the right to have variety. And also a worthwhile heteroglossia. A very famous quote again from Hymes. Sorry, the quotes are from the anthologies rather than the original dates, which is a bit confusing. So Hymes is referring to the fact that we're all used to that in society there's a common perception, there's a right way to speak the Queen's English or whatever, and that the rest is not valid, or it's mistaken, or it's full of grammatical errors, and that people aren't speaking properly, and they've got to learn to speak properly. You get it all over the place, even but from people who were brought up speaking different codes. So Hymes refers to that as the world, the country being a linguistic mush in the view of politicians and others. So even if the country remains, so far as the media detect, and the general population, linguistically some sort of mush, like porridge, those who believe in a society better than we now have should develop a well-grounded technique. What ideal or vision can we entertain in terms of language? Two ingredients of the vision are long-standing. One is a kind of negative freedom, freedom from a denial of opportunity due to something linguistic. So this very important idea that you shouldn't be refused entry to university, refused job in the civil status, being allowed to be an announcer on the BBC because of the way you speak. But this doesn't just necessarily mean that everyone gets the chance to learn to speak like the Queen and therefore can get the jobs. There's another side to it. One is a kind of positive freedom. Freedom for satisfaction in the use of language, for language to be a source of imaginative life and satisfaction. Very, very interested in the different features of voice, how we describe language in detail, not just at random. So Hymes refers back to Worf when he talks about relativity, as you know from Worf, was the fact that different languages in the lexicogramma encode different things to do with time, distance, near, far, vibratory phenomena, numbers, shape of things you count, are encoded in the lexicogramma. That's the first relativity, according to Hymes. But Hymes says we need to look at the second type of linguistic relativity. What are disclosed are not orientations towards space, time, vibratory phenomena and the like, but orientations towards persons, roles, statuses, rights and duties, differences and demeanour. A move to the interpersonal from the SFO point of view. We don't need just to look at the way that the world is construed to lexicogramma, but how society is created, construed, maintained, through language in action. I think Hymes misses an important point here in discounting the experiential. He's talking about the lexicogramma, and Worf talking about what was encoded in the lexicogramma. But when he's talking about the interpersonal, he's talking about what happens in discourse, language in use, how we create these roles and statuses. If we apply that back to the experiential meaning, how the vision of the world is created, reconstructed, day by day in our interactions with people, our understanding of participants, relations, etc., then I think that's equally as valid as part of relativity, the second relativity. Not what's in the lexicogramma, but what we do through discourse as speech communities. He also talks about ethnopoetics. A lot of Hymes' works do ethnopoetics in the way that people speak in particular structures, in rhyming couplets and things like that, or scanned couplets. Jan Blommet is a great student of Hymes'. And he says, Hymes' ethnopoetics revolves around a conception of narratives as primarily organised in terms of formal and aesthetic poetic patterns. Not in terms of content or thematic patterns, but content, in other words, is an effect of the formal organisation of a narrative. What there is to be told emerges out of how it is being told. So if you put Hymes's two conceptions of relativity together with my gloss on his experiential meaning, and we think of what language is and the co-evolution of language in society, not just what's in language and what's in society at the same time, then we have blends very simply with a metafunctional view of voice from SFL, ideational, discursively constructed understandings of events, entities and logical relations, interpersonal through the negotiation of roles and statuses between individuals, and textual, the performance of social activities through specific rhetorical styles where the means of telling is part of the meaning. So to the extent that we have these features are shared within the community, we have a single voice. Well, that's the theory. So let's take it a bit further. Okay, so another guy coming in with talking about voice was the British sociologist Basil Bernstein. He uses the term voice as well, but he uses it rather differently. He talks about the notion of code as including both voice and message. So he's not using it in quite the same way as Hymes is. Hymes is using it to mean a way of speaking, roughly. There's much more to it. What Bernstein talks about is code as a regulative principle, tacitly acquired, which selects and integrates relevant meaning to recognition rules, the form of their realization rules, and evoking context. What that means is, for any community of any size, you're in a context, you recognize it evokes certain meanings for you, you've been there before, you've been socialized into it, so you know what sort of action is appropriate. This doesn't mean there's just one action that's appropriate, you know what range of actions is appropriate. You can be uncooperative, but still within the behaving according to context. So that's the recognition rules of what's possible as a member of this speech community in this context, but you also then need to know how to do that. You know, you can say, I can now in this situation ask for a double room for the night because I'm in a boarding room. But if you don't actually know Spanish and you're in Spain, that's no good. Or you don't know how to do it in that community. So you need to recognize what's possible, and you need to know the right words to put it in that situation. So that's the code. We're socialized into it. It's groups together and it divides. So in this concept, voice is not a means or rights as they are in Hymes, but it's the limits on what could be realized if the identity was to be recognized as legitimate. In other words, it's all the possible legitimate meanings within a particular community. All those things together are that community's voice. What you're allowed to say without breaking the rules. And who are we talking about now? By Bernstein's formulation, this is passed on in society through many different channels, through the church, through lectures like this, through the classroom, through the family. But that there's a voice, a regulatory voice behind it all that holds the community together, but that it's framed in different ways depending on the context. You sort of have to realise this huge, big, legitimate message thing, legitimate voice thing, by individual messages, drip by drip by drip by drip. And that's each of those individual messages or utterances contribute to, maintain, change voice. That's what Bernstein refers to as framing, how you frame the voice. When you give an English lesson or a history lesson, how you tell the accepted version of history, message by message. So framing refers to controls on communication in local interactional pedagogic situations. Framing establishes the message. But there's more than one message for carrying any one voice. So there's one voice in society, this is the theory, in a unitary society, but there's lots of different ways of getting that voice across, and this is really important later on. So just as with vacuum centrifugal forces and centripetal reaction, Bernstein sees the dominant voice, that which can be legitimately set in the public sphere, as passed down to state institutions, notably the school, thus ensuring an equality of rights potential through unequal access to the dominant code. Particularly Bernstein was interested why working class kids didn't do so well at school. It wasn't because they were thick, it was because their way of speaking that they learned at home wasn't the same that was used in the school. They didn't have the same access, they didn't have the same access to the dominant voice, to the dominant code, and they were thus discriminated against. A lot of work done to do with code in SFL, class codes and control, the volumes written and edited by Bernstein, notable contributions particularly from Hassan and Cloran, who looked at the difference in the way working, let's call them working class and middle class mothers in Australia spoke to their children on a daily basis, socialised them, and that was related to their position in the economic scale, how the type of jobs they had, whether it was encouraged conformity or doing what we were supposed to do, or encouraged free imagination, that sort of thing. Really interesting stuff. The pedagogic device, how code is used in literature, in teaching. Fran Christie and the whole generation of people in Australia doing that we referred to the other day. The modern aspect of that, legitimation code theory with Carl Mayton, with Jim Martin and Jacob Doran doing stuff on that. Very interesting work on youth justice in Australia and how kids who are in this situation where they have to explain their actions and show sorrow for their actions so they don't get sent to jail. Different ways of legitimating themselves depending on their social status. One of the things I want to talk about there, interesting, is Burnside and the potential for change, which I find really interesting. What came up yesterday was critical discourse analysis, where we're always saying what's bad. Positive discourse analysis, can we change it? So Burnside says the potential of change is built into the model. Although framing carries the message to be reproduced, okay, we've got this dominant voice and we've got the message and it's a drip, drip, drip of the dominant voice. There's always pressure to weaken that framing because there are many ways to to get the dominant ideology across. There's weakness because they're not so well insulated. And at some point, the weakening of that framing is going to violate the classification. It's going to violate the way things are said in certain contexts. So change can come at the level of framing. There's a lot more to that quote, but the punchline there that I put in italics, you can carry the dominant voice, but at the level of framing, the way it's carried message by message gives us this bit of wiggle room, gives us this bit of leeway to be official, yet at the same time to sneakily do other stuff. So, from those theories of voice, what common themes have we got? My definition of voice, therefore, would be getting things done on one's own terms through language, okay? You've got to be able to achieve stuff through language, not be discriminated against, and hopefully that's on your own terms rather than the dominant bloc. But there's various aspects to it. Instead of trying to narrow it down in one definition, there's all these sort of ideas. We have voice as the legitimate reservoir, the dominant group, the whole reservoir of meanings which can be made in any context, the whole reservoir. What can be heard? Voice is a process, the actual speaking. The voice is making yourself heard and understood. It's the process. Voice is the right to be heard, or voice is the repertoire of a particular group, not the whole reservoir, but the repertoire of a particular group, the local way of speaking. And the limits of legitimate heteroglossia and poetry, how much we're allowed to say things differently. All those ideas, I think, come in all those definitions of voice. I think they might all emphasize different aspects, but you've got this idea of the dominant reservoir, local repertoires and rights coming out through them all. Okay, but someone taking up the idea of voices, Jan Blom, I've mentioned, and he talks about the idea, okay, the world's moved on a bit. We're not just so much interested in working class kids in school in a single culture. That's great. But now we've got a super diverse world. Diversity has become more diverse. There's different types of diversity. Through the instant communication, media, the economic migration, cheap transport, the world's a totally different place. We're super diverse now. So what does voice mean in a super diverse age? Voice stands for the way in which people manage to make themselves understood. It's quite a basic definition, it seems, to start with. Just getting yourself understood, or fail to do. Mixing, intermingling that happens makes the situation much more complicated. And I think SFL is lagging a bit. I'm going to use a schema from Christian here, which I think is based on Michael Halliday's notion of context of culture, and I'm going to politely take issue with it, and Christian here can respond. I actually think that in this diagram there's something that's hidden, that actually is part of SFL theory, that maybe some of our theory hides. When SFL theory talks about codal variation, this is types of variation in language. We've got dialectal variation, which is where people are saying the same thing, same semantic content, using different words and different phonology. Okay, no problem there. At the other end we have registerial variation. The context is different, different registers are used, different semantics, different lexicogramma. Where I would like to, where I think we need to do a bit more work is on the next one, where we've got codal variation, where the context is constant, but the semantics as well as the lexicogramma change. Now I've got a problem with that because context means different things in SFL theory, and it's one of my bugbears or areas of interest, however you phrase it. One of the definitions of context in SFL theory is it's construed by the semantics, rather than what's already there. If that's the case, if you've got semantic variation, it's almost impossible, then context has to be different because it's construed by the semantics. So that's one area, this tension between different meanings of context in SFL. I also have a problem with the general SFL notion of a single context of culture with lots of sub-varieties, and we can just add percentages to explain for all the variation in language and across societies. And I know that's Christian's slide. I think that's standard SFL theory. So it's one issue I'd like to come up. It's approached in the same way by Jim Martin, who does his own work. He talks about affiliation and individuation, where you have the reservoir of the common culture and all the things that are possible. You have subgroups in terms of the master identity, subculture, all the way down to the individual persona, who has their individual repertoire. Now, in one direction, they are individuated, they become subsections of the whole society, and in another direction they can deliberately affiliate to different sections. Again, I think the way it's presented in the diagram and often treated, it looks like that a single persona is a member of a certain subculture, is a member of a master identity, is a member of a culture. And I think that's something to do with the origins of SFL and its classification, but it's something that super diversity really throws open. I wouldn't say we're members as individuals of a subculture or a group which is a member of a subculture, which is a member of a bigger culture, which is a member of the matrix culture. We're all members of lots of different cultures. You know, so as a person, I'm a member of separate subcultures. Those subcultures are all parts of separate master identities that all belong to separate cultures. It becomes a lot messier. And I think SFL actually says that, knows it, but a lot of the things in the way it's presented, often this is a bit lost. This is an idea that's been around a fair while. Copen and Kansalsis, in their very good book, Multiliteracies, talk about this, talking about moving away to design. How can we use discourse analysis to design different futures rather than just critiquing the present? Something that came up in yesterday's talk. And one of the points that they make is that design, instead of a focus on stability and regularity, the focus is on change and transformation. Individuals have at their disposal a complex range of representational resources, never simply of one culture, but of the many cultures in their lived experience, the many layers of their identity and the many dimensions of their being. The breadth, complexity and richness of the available meaning-making resources is such that representation is never simply a matter of reproduction. Rather, it's a matter of transformation, of reconstruing meaning in a way which always adds something to the range of available representational resources. Sorry, that was a PDF from a scan, and therefore I had to sort of cut and paste like a slide, and it's not a proper cut and paste. So we've got this idea that we've actually all got lots of different codes. We don't belong to a single code which is part of a master culture. We all come with different codes to any context. That makes life complicated. It also makes life fascinating because we bring all these extra resources with us, the potential for change. How we do the timings? What's the finish time at the moment?
According to my watch, you have almost.
Oh, let's slow down then. Okay, so instead of looking at the context of culture being divided into subcultures, being divided into groups, just a slight refocusing of that is Blommett's notion of polycentricity, that in any culture there are various centres operating, polycentric, and that in each of those centres, or a centring institution, they bring together what is legitimate, what's appropriate within that particular centring institution. But that might be brought from a diverse range of situations, languages, cultures. If you go, for example, have a PhD student studying Muharram in Cardiff, as a centering institution, that would bring all the Islamic traditions with it, but it would also bring something special about being Cardiff with it. So there's always lots of traditions being brought together. It's not just hierarchical stratification, hierarchical componentiality. It's a mixture. There's all sorts. When we go to any centering institution, we bring a variety of cultures with us that are legitimate in that situation, and it might be a totally different mix in another centering institution. So centering institutions occur at all levels of social life, from the family, small peer groups, more or less stable communities, the state and transnational communities, all the way to the world system. They're a central feature of what Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities. Though imagined, they trigger specific behaviours and generate groups. But it is worth underscoring that the social environment of almost any individual would be by definition polycentric, with a wide range of criss-crossing centres to which orientations need to be made, and evidently with multiple belongings for individuals. Furthermore, such environments would be polycentric and stratified in the sense that not every centre has the equal range, scope and depth. It might be the family, it might be the church, it might be the state. But they're not to be seen as subsections, but as bringing together a different tapestry of resources. Okay, stepping back from the theory a bit and heading towards my own fieldwork. If we see voice as the linguistic realisation of experiential interpersonal systems and practices of a particular social group and the rhetorical styles in which these are transmitted, these are actually realised through language in that particular culture, but they're more than just language. And the question arises, are they translatable? If we go back to Blommaert's idea of semiotic mobility, is it possible to take the semiotic resources of your own language and realise them through another language in another context? Or, in Bernstein's terms, can we use the code of our particular class, our particular upbringing, in other situations and get it legitimated? So we've got our own voice worth hearing, but also the right to have it heard. Can it be translated into other contexts, and from there, can it actually then be made legitimate? So can it be smuggled? I'm suggesting two possible ways. It can be smuggled into centralising institutions, talking about Bernstein talking about the messages. Even though we're sometimes reproducing the dominant voice, maybe we can smuggle little ideas into the messages. Or can it be translated from one language to another? Okay, so I'm going to look at my case study from Guyana in 1999 to 2002. Voice is also a term used in development and also in occupational studies as well, business studies. In these terms, it describes measures ranging from participation of people in decision-making and product delivery to lodging complaints, engaging in organised protests or lobbying, used by civil society actors to put pressure on public sector providers to demand better service outcomes. It's this idea of getting heard, making your voice heard. But the question is, on whose terms? So we've got the centripetal forces. Colonisation, okay, where, for example, the French come to Africa, where a hegemonic external system subordinates the life world of the local group. So you can get your voice heard as long as you speak colonial French, okay? Or enculturation, the loss of culture, and acculturation into another culture, where the life world, the way of living of one group, assimilates into the dominant system. For example, what UKIP wants everyone to do who comes to Britain. You can have your voice heard as long as you do it through standard estuary English. What about the centrifugal forces? How can we make room for alternative voices? Appropriation from Fairclough, all these terms are from Fairclough, where the life world of a local group draws on the dominant external system and accommodates it to its own life world. So the local community with the local voice steal enough of the dominant culture to allow them access, while at the same time staying true to their origins. They appropriate the resources of the dominant group without giving it to them entirely. Related to this idea of development is the amount of participation. My interest in development and participatory democracy comes from the idea that the big groups go in, they assemble the local population who might or might not understand the language, they tell them what's going to happen, and then they write in the report, after free and full consultation with the local groups, it was decided to do exactly what we were going to do in the first place. So there's different levels of participation. Being allowed to attend the meeting, being allowed to hear the meeting, having it at least in your own language, to be heard in the perceptual sense, to be listened to, okay, at least I'm making some effort now, it's the control of my mental behaviours, but to be heard in the cognitive sense then, not just listened to, but actually hearing what you're saying underneath the words. And that's when it started to get to be real participation. But beyond that, to be legitimated. It's no good standing up and speaking in your own voice, making your own claims, if that isn't going to get legitimated. It's just going to get ignored. So how do we get different worldviews legitimated into the mainstream to allow for change? We can do it by regulation. We can say we must listen to alternative voices. We can do it by voluntarism and say, let the nice guys do it. Neither of these work. Okay? Neither of these work. So how can we do it by design? How can we do it from grassroots, from bottom up? I would suggest that it's through assimilation and accommodation between the local way of speaking and the dominant way of speaking to gain a foothold, creating hybridity and polyphony. Okay, so my fieldwork was in Guyana, where I was working with Mary. As I say, there's Guyana. It's actually the size of the United Kingdom, but it looks tiny because it's next to big old Brazil. Georgetown, which is where Mary and I live. Mary did a lot of work down in the orange and yellow areas, which are on the fringes of the Amazon rainforest, and inhabited by Mapuche and Wapishana Amerindian groups. When I was there, I was able to find field work for my PhD with a wonderful organisation called the Northern Benoni District Development Board, who built this fantastic Bina Hill Institute, where they had meetings every 2 months with an international development organisation, the Iwakrama Rainforest Conservation and something program. They would every 2 months for 2 days. The first day they would deal exclusively with Iwakrama, Iwakrama had been gifted the rainforest. What happened then was Uncle Henry, who is a local elder, what was being explained at this meeting was the sustainable utilisation areas, which is exactly what it says on the tin. The areas of the Iwakrama forest are being utilised in a sustainable way. As opposed to the wilderness preserves, nothing was allowed to happen in the wilderness preserves. But in the estuaries, the local communities were allowed to use resources as long as it's sustainable. Sarah, who was an Iwakrama worker, got up and tried to explain it. But if we look at what she did, she used experiential. She referred to these meetings between the NRDDB and the government as semiotic activities, as negotiations, as meetings, etc. To her, the sustainable utilisation areas was about negotiation. In interpersonal terms, she came across as very knowledge-based authority, expert to novice. And textually, she used very abstract, theoretical, and decontextualised language. Then we have Uncle Henry, who came up and stood and made the following presentation. It's very difficult to understand. You'll hear the beautiful bird song coming in through that gap in the NRDB wall, but I haven't transcribed that. But you've got the transcript, and hopefully you should be able to follow it with the transcript. Work immediately before the TV. Okay, understood. You get the idea. It was really difficult to transcribe. That's what I really wanted you to know, how much work I've done in transcribing that. Beautiful bird song, very difficult to work out. As we said, there's some of the transcript there. I like hearing his voice because I think it makes it more real, and it's very, very difficult to hear, especially with impromptu methods. What I... Sorry? Microphone. Okay. You need to know a bit about Uncle Henry. He's an ex-jaguar hunter, which is great. I think everyone should have an ex-jaguar hunter in their data because it's really sexy sort of correspondent to have. He was a jaguar hunter turned gamekeeper. He was a community elder in the local community, but he was also very much involved with the government and the international agencies in setting up the NRDDB. He therefore had a foot in both camps, which is really important. And when I analysed his talk, in contrast to Sarah's, where Sarah had this very outside idea of the sustainable utilisation areas as really a semiotic process, scientifically led with interpersonal scientific authority and abstract. If you look in first blush at Uncle Henry, he described the forest, you've got some of the transcript there, in terms of the community's relationship with the local resources. Okay? Interpersonally, he uses the moral authority of the local elder. He says, you must do this, you must not do that. There's a lot of personal moral authority in there. Also related to the shared social issues. Textually, if you know Carmel Claude and Hassan's rhetorical units, it's very focused on the centre. Here and now, what we do as a community, how the forest works for us in everyday life. Whereas Sarah's was generalisations, hypotheticals and abstractions. So across the three meta-functions, Uncle Henry's contribution is much more centred, is much more the local voice. But what's interesting is that if you look at the frame of the way he presented it entirely appropriately for a meeting of an international organisation, the sort of forums they have. He stood up and spoke in the same structural way as other legitimate speakers. So the voice, and he was talking about the same thing, the social sustainable utilisation area. So the way he spoke and the message he got across was in some ways legitimate, in many ways legitimate. There was nothing threatening about it. But the way he frames it, the way he speaks, smuggles in all these community variables about what the forest means to us, about my role as a village elder, and about local knowledge being on here and now rather than decontextualized. So he managed to smuggle in this voice, this message, in action. But that was my first reading of it. Actually, if you go and read the whole transcript, and it is available, and look what he's... Actually, Uncle Henry switches in and out. He moves position quite a lot. Sometimes he's speaking as the local elder, saying, we share these common resources, it's we, and I'm speaking with a must as part of we. Then sometimes he'll turn around and say, you have to do this. Because he's then talking about the scientific, the Western scientific knowledge, sorry, he's further west than us, the European scientific knowledge combines with his position as outsider. He talks about the community as you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't poison the forest, you shouldn't do this. Sometimes he refers to Abel Kramer along with him as we, sometimes as they. As he does this, the variables change together. The experiential, the interpersonal and the textual all change together, but seamlessly. So in fact, Uncle Henry's developing this hybrid voice, where he's not just speaking as a village elder, but he's speaking as a village elder with knowledge and position and legitimation in the government structures and the international structures. Now he's uniquely positioned to do that. What we think about that, first of all, Sarah explained it badly, no one understood it. I have data to suggest that no one understood it. Uncle Henry came and spoke, everyone understood it, great. But Sarah didn't have any choices. She didn't have the cultural capital. She couldn't have got up and spoken like Uncle Henry, it wouldn't have worked. But what's interesting is that Uncle Henry then, Sarah had already spoken, he was speaking after her, so he was able to bring with him everything she had already said and act like the ventriloquist to subsume some of Sarah's authority within his own authority. Okay, so he was piggybacking on what she had said. So Uncle Henry subsumes her own voice, has his own voice, and that's possible because of who he is, because of his position in the society, in the local community and the international and national community, makes it possible for him to do this. So just for a bit of fun, time over, okay, what does voice look like as polyphony? Well, what have we got? We've got Sarah there speaking with the voice of the outsider, using the messages of the outsider. Then Uncle Henry comes along, he does that, but he adds that his own voice, and he sometimes does that to the messaging system of the outsiders, and sometimes the messaging system of the insiders. It's only a formula, it's not funny, but we've got polyphony in action. It's not just a simple contrast or a dichotomy, there's all sorts of things going on. So, a couple of slides to finish off, it will just be 2 minutes. My idea was that was the community voice and the hybrid voice. But we've got questions here. Can Uncle Henry be said to represent the community voice when what he says is dependent on his individual status in the community? How is it the community voice when it's his individual voice and other people couldn't do it? Can Uncle Henry be said to represent the community voice when his way of speaking also relies on non-community status? He gets away with what he does because of his role outside the community. Can we talk of the NIDV as representative of the community if Sarah's non-community way of speaking was an integral part of it? That needed to be there as the horse for Uncle Henry to piggyback on. So the whole idea of the local voice becomes really complicated in several ways because there's no one individual that speaks for the community, and there's people from outside the community who are part of the community, but sort of part of making the voice. So we need to avoid essentialism. There's not a community voice. One of the ways I came up thinking about it is that Well, community voice is heard when the contextual configuration, the way of speaking of one participant, field, tenor and mode, interpersonal, textual and experiential, when their contribution, when the contextual configuration of their contribution instantiates a role that's recognised within that community. So Uncle Henry stands up and speaks, and the way he brings together his interpersonal values, his experiential ideas, and the rhetorical traditions of the text are befitting his status in the local community. Therefore, community voice is heard. It's not a single community voice, but in his doing that, we hear community voice in action. So hybrid discourse, a single act begins to many different communities and has different legitimate voices in each, different statuses, and he can bring them all together in hybrid form. So, we have the NIDB as a new centering institution where new varieties are available, where what is legitimate is based on the NIDB, not on Guyana, not on Iwakrama, not on the world relations, but what's valid in the NIDB. That includes polyvocality and subsumption. So Sarah's way of speaking as an outsider, Uncle Henry's way of speaking, but also local councillors' ways of speaking, local farmers' ways of speaking, are all part of that centering institution which is the NIDB. It looks hybrid, but it's only hybrid when it's new. When it's been around a while, that will just be the way of speaking. Everything is hybrid until it's been around a while. So once it's been around a while, that will be the NIDB way of speaking. The whole polyphony will be accepted and legitimated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. We're just a couple of minutes over, but we still have the closing ceremony, and those of you going off on your journey this afternoon will want to quickly have lunch and get ready. Could I suggest that we take comments and questions from those of you who want to offer them, and that we perhaps leave discussion to the lunch time, or as you're viewing the sites at Carthage and the rest of the afternoon. So, yes, is there someone to...
Thank you, Tom, for your fascinating talk on voice. Really very interesting. I wanted to ask you a question, particularly on context. You're interested in context, and I was wondering if whether your position on the criticism on the lack of integration of cognitive dimension to the context. Criticism like Van Dyck in his 2008, a whole chapter devoted to SFL criticizing the lack of, you're working on social communities, on hegemony, on things that are really, they don't take into account interfaces. The interface, advocated by at least the socio-cognitive approach, that there is no, it's not possible to be studying discourse and society without taking account the interface of cognition. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's the Van Dyck chapter I'm well aware of. I think I described it recently as over-enthusiastic and under-informed. There's a lot of good critique in there, but he's not very up-to-date on SFL theory, and I think part of the problem with Van Dyck's critique is SFL, we've often given the wrong impression. SFL does have a cognitive approach, it's just not really focused on. Ruqaiya Hassan herself talks about context as what the individual speakers make of it. And so it fits with all the socio-cognitive stuff Van Dyck is talking about, but we've tended not to focus on that. I've a similar critique. I think that a lot of SFL studies, not all, a lot of SFL studies are very textualist, what Blommaert refers to as textualism. And we look at the text and we say this is what's happening, as if we can get it all from the text, and I don't believe we can do that. I think we need to shove it into the context, and that's what I'm trying to do. And the context works at many levels, including what individuals understand by it, and that's why it's important to look at Uncle Henry as an individual and his unique position. I wouldn't go into the cognitive I think the cognition's there, I don't know what he's thinking, but he has an individual role, and that was very important to what was happening there, and without understanding that through a wider examination of context, you wouldn't be able to understand the text. So, Pache Makaya Hosani says you can read the context off the text. I disagree. You can read something off the text, and if you know the context as well, you can read something again. So I'm in agreement with what you're saying, but I think Van Dijk's chapter sets up quite a few straw men, which he then knocks down. But there's also a lot of genuine criticism in there.
If anyone else has a very quick comment to make, we could take that now, and if not, we leave your other comments and questions to Tom for later, so that we can move to the close. Ms. Christian.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly. Fantastic, brilliant, and the sort of grounding these people who tend to be somewhat stratospheric, like Martin or Voloshinov. We don't know whose voice it really is, right? But grounding it in real contextualized data, I think that's an extraordinary contribution. Now, I would add another David but, and I sort of leave it as an open question to be explored. You've covered so much, but I wonder about Malinowski and Firth, because it seems to me that's part of what you say is missing in the overview. I mean, the whole discussion, so many things of what Bakhtin is famous for, Malinowski had already established, right? Long time, grounded in fieldwork, in communities, not in Dostoevsky, but in fieldwork. And then coming from the contextualism, Firth's work on the person, the personae, the lines we speak and so on. I just wonder how these would figure in the overall construction of this fascinating, let me say, synthesis of insights into voice and multi-voicedness and so on. Thank you.
So thanks, Christian. That's a big question. I agree totally. I mean, the SFL idea of context of culture largely comes from Malinowski and Firth, but there are obviously parallels as well. I don't think there's any quick and simple answer to what you're saying, but myself and others are working on the SFL notion of context and trying to bring in the contributions of all these things, but also putting them in their time and seeing the limitations of them, but also how things have changed. I think SFL as a theory has changed in certain ways that is no longer totally compatible with Malinowski and Firth in terms of context and language, and that there's some tensions there that need to be explored to reconcile them, so that we've got a richer understanding of the notion of context and language, which can then be explored within the wider idea of voice and rights to voice and individual voices and change. But it's a huge and ongoing polyphonous project.
Okay, I think we will close the final session, the final last plenary session, by thanking Tom very much. Please don't move. Please don't leave. Oh, but this is on. Wait, I have a loud voice. I don't need this. The battery. We're going to move to the closing ceremony. Would you mind closing the the lights? And we have a few special things planned. First, I'm going to ask Rachel and Mick. Sorry, Rachel, there you are. Rachel and Mick. We need Mick. And here he is, just in time.
So, we'd just like to take the opportunity from the UAM to make visible the agreement we have with the University of Sfax, which is an Erasmus Mundus called the Batuka project, where we have agreements and exchanges. We talked to the Pro-Vice Chancellor of International Relations, who sends an institutional greeting from our sister university, and we have brought some small institutional presents for the organizer and for the wonderful helpers of the team. So we'd like to give them to you, and we'd like you to distribute them. So thank you very much.
Okay, I think I'm going to bestow upon myself the honor of thanking Akila and her entire team for this event and for all of the hard work. And the reason I do that is simply because I've watched the developments take place. This is something that has been planned for some time. It's wonderful to see it come to pass. And I also, as all of you, have experienced a really wonderful conference. And I'm going to say something that may seem a bit corny. There's an American film called Field of Dreams. Tom's going to know what I'm probably going to say. And there's a line from this film that says, "If you build it, they will come." And it's kind of something I've adhered to, even though it comes from a Hollywood film. Because for me, it symbolizes belief and faith. And in the face of adversity, when other people might not think something can be achieved. And when this belief and faith is carried out with integrity and sincerity, then, like the beautiful Tunisian smile, it is contagious, and other people believe too. They have built it, and we have come. And I think that that's a fantastic achievement, and there is much more to come. So, on behalf of everyone, we would like to present you with these flowers as a small token of all the way from Wales, because I think people forget that there is a country called Wales in Great Britain. But I'll explain what this is. It's a small token of a feeling. It says Croeso Cynnes, which in Welsh, sorry for my Welsh pronunciation, but most of you won't know I didn't do a good job. This means warm welcome. I think you will all agree, when you come to Tunisia, you get a warm welcome. And I hope you feel the same for when you come to Cardiff. So I hope you will hang this in your office or in your apartment as a reminder of the affection that we have for each other and the collaboration between our departments. There can be no house built without a foundation. And I think you will also all agree with me, I'm voicing all of your thoughts for you if you don't mind, that you will agree that Akila has behind her a fantastic team. And it's a bit embarrassing because I know when they come to Wales, the food isn't top on the list. And we often give things like food and wine as gifts. So I have something that's really a token of appreciation. And I was thinking that even if you don't eat what is inside, you will agree that you have nice tins to put things in. And even though your tea is better than ours, you will still enjoy a cup of tea and some biscuits together and remember this occasion. Thank you very much. Okay, now I'm done, and I'm turning over you.
Well, I hope you can hear me. We also would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Lise Fontaine from the University of Cardiff for all her support on behalf of the organizing committee and all the team. I would like to present her, or to give her a very small present as a souvenir from the organizing committee, and thank you very much, Lise, for everything. Right. we would also like to thank Professor Akila Salem Batluti and Professor Ali Batluti, the Batluti family, for all the help they provided for the preparation of this conference. Professor Ali Batluti is a musician who has attended most of the sessions and who has shown, great support before and during the conference. His kids as well. Professor Akila Salem Batluti, we can't thank you enough for all the efforts you've made all through the preparations. And just to let you know, these preparations, the idea started like 6 years ago, back in 2010, when we were in Cardiff, and we've been thinking about how to make it, to make this dream come true, and it's because of efforts of Professor Akila Salem Batluti and all the organizing team, but your presence here is also, a real honor for us, and we really appreciate the great presentations we've attended during these 3 days. I hope you enjoyed your stays, and we wish you a very safe, trip back home. And we would love to see you again, probably in coming conferences as well. This is the first, not the second, not the last. So sorry if I'm being, a bit long and emotional. So thank you very much. A very, very warm thank you from all the team. I keep this for the last thing. So, again, a small gift for the Batluti, for the help, and for everything. Thank you very much. We love you.
I think that that's nothing for me to say. Thank you all for your presence. Thank you for all our invited speakers. Thank you for Liz for her cooperation. Thank you for this fantastic team. Thank you, Ali, for all your help. Thank you to all participants for their high quality presentations. I think that the conference is not successful without the help of both organizing committee and audience, and you've been a fantastic audience all these 3 days. Thank you for bearing with us. Sometimes we won't talk, some problems of misorganization. I hope we can overcome that in future conferences, and we are waiting for your suggestions or any criticism for anything, so that we can take that into account for future events. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your insightful comments. Thank you for your support. Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. And the first, and I think the most important, something we discussed with Liz yesterday, is that a volume of publication will follow the conference. We'll be issuing a call for participation in an edited volume, and you will be invited to submit your paper for review. And we'll be working on that to publish the selection of presentations, of course, after evaluation. Now, second announcement of the more practical things, okay? The coach for the excursion will leave at 2 sharp, so please be gathered in front of the hotel at 1:45. Now, one other announcement for our non-Tunisian colleagues, and I'm really not proud to say this, but you will have to pay an airport tax, so please keep 30 dinars after you pass the police, because you will have to pay that. I'm not very proud of this, but you have to buy stamp at the airport, and normally the information that they will tell you. Yes. Now, those who have not fetched their certificates yet, please collect them at the end. They are all here. Okay? There is their payment receipt. Now, and if you need any other paper, just contact me and we will do the necessary. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you in future occasions.